Hello, everybody. Welcome to Appreciating Poetry. I'm Dr. Kelly. We've been spending uh, some very pleasant time over the last few weeks looking at the Songs of Innocence and of Experience by William Blake. Uh, and so we're going to finish our time with Songs of Innocence and of Experience with London, and we've already been talking about it for a few sessions. We looked at the picture, which shows a blank city wall with a door in it, and an old man with a waist-long beard wearing kind of a robe, and a child wearing robe of a different color leading the old man forward. And then we see a smaller inset picture of a giant billowing flame with dark blue smoke uh, pervading the image, and the child warming his hands before this enormous fire. And that pair of pictures says something about the relationship of age and childhood, the relation of experience and innocence, that innocence is a guide for experience, because children require uh, nourishment, children require care. And in order to provide care, somebody has to have experience how to care for a child. And decent people, when they have children of their own, or when they see children in need, they do what they can to help the child. So because of the inherent neediness of children, they kind of guide people toward the right thing and taking care of other people. Similarly, um, so so similarly, experience provides something for innocence. Innocence provides something for experience. And I want to emphasize how realistic this picture is. This is not an idealized view of life. This is life, and it's kind of the best of life. It's not the world of political economy. It's certainly not the world of negotiation, of pushing and pulling. Um, it's the world in which experience takes care of innocence, and is so often the case. What is the situation in the external world is also the situation in the internal world, in the subjective world. That the innocent part of us is a guide for the experienced part of us, but the experienced part of us has to take care of, protect, and nourish the innocent part of us. Now, London, big city, kind of a big abstract machine. Uh, the streets are chartered, right? So the physical material streets have been configured politically in this abstract way. What's the difference between a street that's chartered and a street that's unchartered? Well, the street that's chartered uh, has been given permission by the state to exist. And the state, or the large scale social aggregate, is so arrogant that it even imagines that it's chartered the river. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and there's some sort of relation. It's not specified here, but there's some sort of relation between this political regulation of the street and the river and the psychological and social state of people that near where the chartered Thames does flow, I, the speaker of the poem, notice in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, we've talked throughout this series of discussions about the origin of poetry in sound and the close relation, of poetry to song. And these are songs of innocence, and this one, a song of experience. So as we experience life, we experience the sights and especially the sounds of dysfunction. Little kids, they don't know. I mean, they know when they themselves are in pain, but what they don't have enough experience to really understand social ills. But the speaker, who's independent, grown up, wandering through the streets, notices these signs of weakness and woe in every face he meets. Now, the first stanza is all visual, it's all very general. Starting with the second stanza, the focus for the remainder of the poem is on sound, not on sight. I guess I should say emphasis, since focus is a visual term. The emphasis on the poem after that very general first stanza is very specific and emphatic of sound. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, general, in every band, specific, a prohibition, the mind forged manacles I hear. So he hears clinking chains of slavery and imprisonment, manacles like giant handcuff shackles, chains that uh, uh, drastically abridge individual freedom. And so in the cry of men and in the infant's cry of fear, the speaker hears this imprisonment, this enslavement. Now, men could cry out in pain, but men could also cry out in commerce. So the word cry could have to do with street criers, with those who are selling goods or services. Infants can't speak, so their vocal communication is largely limited to cries. And the cry of an infant is not necessarily pathological. Infants cry when they are in need, and adults who are decent gratify the needs of children. It's very strange, though, to speak of an infant's cry of fear. To some extent, especially when it comes to abstract entities, fear is a learned response. So you remember the poem about the tiger is full of dread, full of fear, but the tiger this tiger is kind of an abstract idea of tiger, that it's burning brightly in the forests of the night. And the forests of the night are not the forests of Africa or Asia or the Americas. The forest of the night is a forest that is generated from fear. So it's kind of a vicious cycle of fear. in the tiger poem. And I think there's a vicious cycle of fear and weakness and woe in London. It's very strange that the infant would cry in fear. I mean, the infant can cry in discomfort. The infant might cry out of hunger. And these are actually quite normal cries. The infant cries with being born. But this is specifically a cry of fear, and that's very troubling because adults should protect children from threats. In every voice, generally, in every band, specifically a prohibition, thou shalt not. The mind forged manacles I hear. So uh, uh, Blake had lots of names for the father god, the sky god. Um, and one of those was the great forbidder. Okay, so I talked about the cry as rather ambiguous, the cry of every man is rather ambiguous, unlike the very specific infant's cry of fear. Now, the chimney sweeper's cry is definitely a cry of commerce. However, so just as men cry the seafood they're selling, oysters or fish on the street, or they're crying fruits and vegetables come by, these goods or services like knife sharpening. The chimney sweeper is crying a service. The chimney sweeper is crying out, let me sweep your chimney for money. Now, we need to know what I learned from Blake before I learned it from history books. And that is that the chimney sweeper is a little boy, very small, small for two reasons. First of all, he's malnourished. And secondly, he's very young. He may be as young as 5 years old. And he's been sold into slavery by parents who couldn't afford to keep him. And so I say decent adults take care of kids, but what we have here is a social system that is not uh, uh, ensuring the most basic of human needs. Now, Blake has a pair of poems, one song of innocence, one song of experience, called The Chimney Sweeper. And in that pair of poems, the chimney sweeper has a speech impediment, a specific speech impediment, which is an inability to speak S consonant blends. So that one of my kids, when they were just very young, 3 years old, learning how to talk, couldn't say the word spoon. S consonant P, little kid couldn't say it. After he got a little older, he said it fine, but as a 3-year-old, he would say boon instead of spoon. Blake's little chimney sweeper has this same speech impediment, so that when he's crying, chimney sweeping, sweep, sweep, he doesn't say sweep, he says weep. So the chimney sweeper's cry announcing his service comes out as a vocal mark of woe and weakness. Weep, weep. But we're reading this poem, and the chimney sweeper's cry, every blackening church appalls. So, poets mess with word order. English, we're far too dependent on word order to make sense out of our sentences. Uh, 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 Languages like Latin and Greek and German that have inflectional endings make it a lot easier to figure out what's the subject and what's the object. But here, the cry clearly appalls the church. Every blackening church. So it's kind of hard for me to describe how Blake, through the use of very carefully controlled ambiguity, just packs every word with meaning, right? So that the cry of every man is both a cry of woe and a cry of commerce. So the chimney sweeper's cry appalls every blackening church. To be appalled means to be disgusted, resentful. We usually use it in the passive voice, I am appalled, but here the cry appalls the church. And I have a feeling that Blake knows that the Paul in Paul is the Paul in appall, the syllable Paul in the word appall is the same word as pale. To pall is to pale, to grow pale. Now, this is what's called a dead metaphor. In other words, we don't think about something turning pale when we say that I'm appalled. When I say I'm appalled, I'm not saying I'm turning pale. That's the origin of the word, however. So the cry of the chimney sweeper literally, in a dead metaphor, appalls every blackening church. Now it's ambiguous. Is every church blackening, or does the cry appall only all of the churches that are blackening? In other words, all of the churches that are blackening are appalled by the cry, but there may be some churches that are not blackening. I have a feeling that in London, pretty much all the churches are blackening. And the reason for that is that it's cold in London. And by the end of the 18th century, when this poem was written, fires in London were coal fires. I mean, you couldn't haul all the timber. There isn't that much timber in England to burn firewood in all of the hearths and all of the factories in 1789 London. And so they're hauling coal in. And we've seen coal fires before in Blake with his reference to the forge. But here, so we have, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of coal fires going on in London. And here's another fun fact. Coal, is a fossil fuel. And it's solid and it's extremely impure. Now, it's true that the carbon in coal is an amorphous solid. In other words, it's not a crystalline solid. That would be a diamond. A carbon crystal is a diamond. So this is really what's called an amorphous solid. It's a very slow liquid. Glass is another example of an amorphous solid. It's solid, but it doesn't have a crystalline structure like a true solid. And of course, there's all kinds of dirt and sulfur and matter that's not carbon in coal. And, coal comes out of the ground. It's not charcoal for your barbecue. Uh, so here's the fun fact. The coal doesn't burn very completely. Indeed, an awful lot of the coal, I don't know if it's more than 50%, but of the coal that's burning in the fire, a lot of it just vaporizes. So it doesn't burn and send up smoke. It essentially boils and sends up coal in a gaseous or gas droplet form, vaporizes. And the thing about vapors is that they condense. So while it's hot in the fire, it's boiling and rising as tiny droplets of liquid coal. And this immediately condenses within the chimney, and it just gradually closes up with a substance called coal tar. And that's what the chimneys are sweeping out. So we tend to think, Dick Van Dyke, the chimney sweep in Mary Poppins, we tend to think they got these brushes and it's particles. And there is a lot of that. There is a lot of soot, but there's also this very heavy tarry substance. It's almost like coal that has just recondensed. Now, these little bitty boys, they go up into the fireplace. See, a grown man, he would have to be outside the fireplace and run the brushes up the chimney, but the little boy can stand up in the fireplace and run the brushes. And of course, all of that coal, all that soot and all that tar is falling down all over the kid. So I'm not going to go into too much more gruesome detail, but the little kids die. And they often died of cancer, which is a horrible way to die. So just imagine like a 6-year-old boy with cancer caused by his occupation. And by the way, 6-year-olds shouldn't be working. They should be talking to sheep out in the barnyard. Uh, so the chimney sweeper's cry appalls every blackening church. So the churches are blackening literally because there's coal dust, soot falling all over them. Churches are often whitewashed, painted white. Uh, you know, but notice appall nowadays has forgotten its literal meaning of turning pale. So the blackening definitely has the literal meaning of being covered with soot, but it also has the figurative meaning of well, the stain of sin, the blot of wrongdoing, right? So the church may say that it's appalled by child labor, but the church didn't take any steps that I know of to end child labor in the 18th century or the 19th century. And there's a little delicate ambiguity in the word church. I mean, it means the building, but it also means the institution. So the institution is appalled by the cry of the chimney sweeper, but the chimneys in the church need to be swept. And then we forget about the little chimney sweeper, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Okay, the hapless soldier. So he's an innocent. He's just a guy, and he's hapless. He's unlucky. It's sort of clumsy. Hapless means not means basically unlucky, but he's like uh, one of these guys that attracts hard times. And that's just how it is for a soldier. Now, Blake, I'm sure, knows the root of soldier in the word sold. And don't forget that the chimney sweeper was sold to become a chimney sweeper. And the soldier has sold his body voluntarily or not. In fact, it's not even worth thinking about whether it's voluntary or not, right? So, the big global situation is that rich landowners are kicking farmers and shepherds off of their land. There used to be common land. There used to be, the village green, and also just land held in common. But you know, big landowners generally who had titles, uh, they kicked the people who were already living there, kicked them off, said go away. And so these people went to the city and they sold their bodies. So parents of the little chimney sweeper sold the little chimney sweeper, and the soldier uh, sells his body to the army. And he might well have been just pressed into service. I think that was more common in the Navy than in the Army, but I'm 100% positive that being a private soldier in the British Army was nothing nice in 1789. Now, so his sigh figuratively runs in blood down palace walls. So notice the palace is a building and an institution, like the church is a building and an institution. The cry of the chimney sweeper blackens the church, although literally it's the chimney sweeper's, the cause for the chimney sweeper's occupation, which is the coal residue that literally blackens the church. The soldier's occupation is to die for the crown. Now, this soldier is in London, so he's not out fighting a war somewhere. Uh, but he's sighing, and that is another auditory mark of weakness and woe. So it's staining with the blood of soldiers, the wall of the palace, which is both an institution and a building. But his sigh, his exhalation may also literally run in blood down the palace walls, because in the British Army and in London, uh, tuberculosis, new disease, was, I don't know if it met the public health definition of an epidemic, but there was a lot of tuberculosis in all big cities starting in the 18th century. So the soldier's exhalation, his sigh, could literally stain the palace that he's guarding with blood. Now, most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So I've already talked about two plagues, two diseases that were wiping out people in London. One was the cancer that chimney sweepers died of. And it was scrotal cancer, by the way. I don't know why got located on their scrotum, I guess in their crotch, the 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 soot and the tar just accumulates. So cancer and tuberculosis, cancer for the chimney sweeper, tuberculosis for the soldier, crowd disease, tuberculosis. But most through midnight streets, I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tears. This is extremely complex. Maybe we ought to start with the end and work our way forward. Blights with plagues to marriage hurts. So I've mentioned two literal plagues, two literal epidemic diseases in London, cancer and tuberculosis. And of course, uh, uh, harlots, prostitutes, sex workers are major sources of sexually transmitted infections, especially syphilis, which is a death sentence in slow motion. A blight is a plague. Here it's used as a verb. So the harlot's curse, blights with plagues, the marriage hearse. Marriage hearse? So a hearse is a vehicle for carrying a corpse. So is the marriage a corpse? Well, there was a double standard, as I'm sure you know, in most of the world. Uh, I would love to say that it's different now, but to a great extent, people of different genders are not treated the same. They're not treated equitably. Specifically, when we refer to double standard, we're referring to a double sexual standard, that men who entered into marriage were expected not to be virgins. Indeed, the word virgin was never applied to a man. That is to say, men who entered into marriage were expected to be sexually experienced. Indeed, it was somewhat disgraceful for a man to go into marriage without having ever had any sexual experience. So this was kind of it was a cultural practice. It was virtually a ritual to provide a young man with a prostitute to make him a man so that he was eligible for marriage. Women, of course, who had sexual experiences outside of marriage were ruined and unmarriageable. Now, the number of prostitutes in big cities is enormous, and it was particularly enormous in this big city, one of the largest in the world, maybe the largest, in this age of very rigid class distinction and also a very rigid double sexual standard. So here's this carriage, upper class vehicle driving the newlyweds away from their wedding to go start their new life together. But the carriage is actually a hearse because the husband has been made a man by a prostitute before he has entered into the marriage. Therefore, he will inevitably infect his new bride. So the perfect ambiguity of the language here, that the harlot's curse, now literally a curse is a malediction, right? An ill speech, the opposite of a benediction, a well-wishing, a well-speaking. A malediction, a curse is not you should have a good morning or you should have a blessed day, but you should die, you should suffer, and you should experience weakness and woe. I mean, that's what a curse is. Literally, a curse is kind of a magic spell for something to go bad for somebody. I mean, a blessing is kind of a magic spell for something, or we think of it as a wish for somebody to enjoy good things. So the harlot is literally damning this married couple, right? You should suffer disease. You should go to hell. You should be unhappy. However, the harlot's curse is also figuratively a sexually transmitted infection. So she literally blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Right? So plague is literal if curse is figurative, but curse is literal if plague is figurative. Right? Because a curse literally is to say something mean. So the harlot, the young sex worker, youthful harlot, sees she ought to be out milking cows. So she's hurling verbal damnation at the married couple. She's screaming at them, and she's screaming at her baby. And I mean, I can't imagine the life of a woman who is forced to turn her body into an object of commerce. I can't imagine that life. Now I can't imagine that life with a newborn baby. How's she going to feed that baby? How good is that baby for the commercial venture that she's been brought into? I mean, how's that going to work? Right? And sexually transmitted infection is an occupational hazard, and so is pregnancy. So she's screaming at the baby, and now I know why the baby is crying out in fear. Because the mother who should be nourishing this baby, protecting this baby, can't provide for this baby and instead hates this baby. This baby is making her life even worse than it already was. Now, I'm not an expert at epidemiology. I'm not an expert in anatomy and physiology and medical science. However, I do know that newborn infants don't shed tears. I also know that sexually transmitted infections infect babies, if not in utero, in the birth canal. And that this is a major cause of congenital blindness, that a baby takes on an infection in the birth canal, and the infection is located in the eyes. And this is what I hear most. That we don't think about the states of the human soul. We don't think about innocence and experience. We don't think about the relation of experience responsible for innocence. We don't think about the relation of innocence as a guide to experience. We just think of male and female bodies and big and little bodies. And I gotta say, the world of commerce is the world that exploits bodies. And so you can see on the countenance of humans' bodies marks of weakness and marks of love. And that's the last word for songs of innocence and experience. We know how innocence and experience should be related. It should be a mother opening a book to nourish the minds of her children. But the world of the city, the world of civilization, won't let that happen. I mean, it'll let it happen for people of a particular social class. But if you've been driven from your rural home to the city, so I don't have a pleasant farewell. And I increasingly see a world and hear the sounds of a world dominated by selfishness, a world in which people don't see any particular need to consider the needs of other people. So we're going to continue looking at social critique in poetry from right around this same period, from the early 19th century. And we're going to shift our focus from Blake back to William Wordsworth. And we're going to look at 2 or 3 poems by William Wordsworth that focus on the selfishness of people in the modern world. Now, Wordsworth is much more optimistic than Blake is. I mean, the world is horribly messed up in Blake's London. Wordsworth's London, there's a little glimmer of hope. So things will cheer up slightly next week. But we're going to look at a couple of poems of Wordsworth and maybe a work of Percy Shelley that are very pointed social commentary, social critique. And so we're going to be in social critique mode for a few weeks. Then we're going to shift gears drastically and talk about the aestheticism of John Keats, the equation of beauty and truth. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for visiting me at Appreciating Poetry Forward. wordpress.com. I guess it's also on YouTube, but it'd be better if you go to my website, appreciating poetry for.wordpress.com. And let me mention that I am not trying to make a dime on this. This is not a commercial venture. This is just my trying to share my appreciation of poetry with anybody who's interested. And if you're interested, I appreciate it. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.